the final sort of subplot of this episode was, for me at least, the most interesting one. Probably not coincidentally, because it involves two of the show's more interesting characters. But that's Carol coming and trying to talk Ezekiel into sort of taking the mantle again and taking up his performance. By the way, I love when she comes in and he's like sort of just lounging and he's got a chain wrapped over one leg. He looks like he's posing for an album cover.
His poor tiger's chain. He's sad about his tiger, his CGI tiger.
Yeah. I think that scene is pretty interesting for at least one reason, which is there's a point in the episode, in that scene, where Carol says to Ezekiel, "I'm performing too," essentially. And I think that there's a couple different ways you can read that. I think that one of the sort of, The Walking Dead is not a great character drama often, I think mostly because it tends to reduce its characters to very simple objectives and very simple sort of characteristics and traits. Carol remains one of the more interesting characters on the show because I think you can't always know immediately what's going on in her head.
Yeah.
And when she says that she's been performing, I think that becomes a little bit of an open question. Is the version of her that this sort of tough as nails, willing to do what it takes, just super badass that we see from Carol and we have over the last few years, is that the performance, or is the more vulnerable side that she's showing Ezekiel in that moment the performance? Is she saying, that part of me is gone now, this is who I am now? I think that's an open question.
I think you're right. I think that's a good point. And first of all, to call out the characters like her and Morgan and these people who are sort of, we don't really know what's going on with them. And not only that, but we've seen, as opposed to most of the characters on the show, we've seen big character arcs for these people, right? We've seen real changes in the dynamics from like the first seasons to now. Both of which, those two things together, I think are what gives you somebody as charismatic as. I cannot remember the actor who plays Carol's name, but those kinds of performances. And so
Melissa McBride? Is that it?
Melissa McBride, thank you.
Okay.
And so when you get that moment and you get a chance to have two of those characters together, sort of playing off each other's inscrutability in that way, because even Ezekiel, who we saw sort of fall apart last episode and do the I'm just a guy, I'm just some guy, as the title of the episode said. Is a chance to really actually let them sort of luxuriate in actually playing some ambiguity and drama for a change.
Well, it's some real character drama for once.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I think they're both pretty good characters, and I think that him saying that you made me feel real, that's a real character beat. That the show could stand to have more of.
Absolutely.
There is a little bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't with The Walking Dead. I'm willing to admit, as somebody who continues to watch this show and continues to rag on it. There are times when my complaint is that it's just people sitting around talking and that the story never moves forward. And then there's other times where I'm complaining that the show doesn't have any time for nuance of character. I think both those things can be true, but I do think that sometimes we're very hard on this show.
We are, but I will say, I thought Zach in his review, which you can read now on theavclub.com.
Nice plug.
Had a really good point where he said, but the difference between Carol and Ezekiel's conversation and, say, Maggie and Aaron's later in the episode, who also have this sort of debate about grief and loss and how do you go on and all that. And he points out that, well, no, Carol and Ezekiel, they actually have very specific things that they're referencing, very specific backstories, very specific things that they're doing, whereas Maggie and Aaron basically just exchange platitudes that could be uttered by any two characters on this show.
They have to have that conversation because we need to be reminded that they're both grieving someone.
Exactly. As though the show would ever let us forget that everyone is grieving all the time, endlessly, forever and ever. Amen. I mean, that's the show's bread and butter for how to tread water in between action set pieces. So I do think there is something to be said for. It's not just the sort of damned if you do, damned if you. There's a way that the show can do both and do it well. It's just that, as we all know, more often than not, it can do one or the other, but very rarely both at the same time well.